From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, it's just gone 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world it's time for the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat on the matters that really concern you in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth and to inform, educate and entertain, all with dignity and respect. And it's essential, as I always say, that we don't just ask the questions, but question those answers. Well, today I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by Dr. Clare Craig and looking at a really important issue, the ongoing threat to child safety, including looking at the draft UN Convention against cybercrime and just what the proposals are regarding sex education in schools. Lots of worrying reports in the press, as always. Dr. Clare Craig, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks ever so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure. And Basil will be joining us as well for the usual Muckrakers, TNT Titan. In the meantime, Dr. Clare Craig is co-chair of the Heart Group and a diagnostic pathologist. She has been a pathologist since 2001, working in the NHS. She specialises in cancer diagnostics and was the clinical lead for the data team and led research and development projects at Genomics England. Clare, do you mind if I call you Clare, or do you prefer Dr. Craig?
That's fine.
Claire is good. Okay, thank you. You can call me Mr. Eborn. It's good. Really, really important issue. It gets the media bursting a blood vessel about children and child safety in the current environment and exactly what is being taught in school. Let's start, if we can, at just outlining just how big is this problem.
Okay, just to clarify, I'm not actually currently working for the NHS, but I used to. I'm currently full-time working as a co-chair of Heart, unpaid, and writing books. Anyway, the extent of the problem is a lot wider than I think most people appreciate. So, I think we've all sort of grown up through an era of increasing emphasis on the need for sex education in schools, and I don't think I know anybody who objects to the principle behind having sex education in schools, and it's important that children are armed with information to protect themselves. But the way the WHO are currently presenting it, they have sort of published standards for what they expect to be in sex education in Europe. And I think they've kind of crossed the line for most sort of reasonable people in what they're proposing. So they want teachers to be talking to children who are under the age of 4 about masturbation. They want 6-year-olds to know about not just where babies come from as a principle of the way that I would have taught my children, but actually intercourse. They want pornography on the curriculum for 9-year-olds. And by the time they're 15, they've including transactional sex, which is not just about prostitution, but they're talking about small gifts and that kind of a relationship, which, perhaps is something you do want to discuss as a negative thing. But the way it's presented, it's not presented in that way in the document that they produced.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the report, and as you say, it's quite alarming when you hear those headlines. This is what they say in their introduction, because I think it's important to put it into context. The WHO European region faces many challenges with regard to sexual health, rising rates of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, unintended teenage pregnancies and sexual violence, to name just a few. Children and young people are crucial to the improvement of sexual health in general. They need to know about sexuality in terms of both risk and enrichment in order to develop a positive and responsible attitude towards it. In this way, they'll be enabled to behave responsibly not only towards themselves, but also towards others in the society. They go on, and this is their justification, if you like. We're going to do a deeper dive into this. They say traditionally sexuality education has focused on the potential risks of sexuality, such as unintended pregnancy and STI. This negative focus is often frightening for children and young people. Moreover, it does not respond to their need for information and skills, and in all too many cases, it simply has no relevance to their life. And they go on to say a holistic approach based on an understanding of sexuality as an area of human potential helps children and young people to develop essential skills to enable them to self-determine their sexuality and their relationships at the various developmental stages. It supports them in becoming more empowered in order to live out their sexuality and their partnerships in a fulfilling and responsible manner. These skills are also essential for protecting themselves from possible risk. So that's their preamble, if you like, to where they are. What you've just outlined, however, Claire, is going to be shocking for most parents. And I want to realise and understand how we got to that position. Who was consulted that it's appropriate to teach very age-inappropriate things, which you just described, to such vulnerable minds?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure who they consulted to get that together with, actually. And often with these documents, you never really know who the authors are. You know, that's sort of so much often the case when something like this happens. It's just sort of the WHO. And you know, I do see that there are situations where there are children who you might want to ensure that they've got some vocabulary to be able to express things that they might be at risk of. And you know, in terms of things like pornography, you don't want to be talking about it when it's already a bit too late and they've already been exposed. You know, I can understand those arguments. I'm not averse to those arguments. But I also think that there's this kind of problematic situation we have where teachers are expected to have all of these conversations when the relationship you have with your teacher is deserving of some protection in itself. You know, if they're given all of the trickiest conversations to be having with children, then that disturbs their relationship with that child. And obviously not every parent is going to be doing educating children in the way that perhaps we as a society feel that they need to be in this regard. And so that is a challenge. And you could be very kind and say, well, you can interpret these things in different ways. But personally, I do not think you need to be talking to under 4-year-olds about masturbation. I don't think that benefits the children in any way. And I think that that's also true about, I don't think 6-year-olds need to know about intercourse. I don't think that benefits them in any way. And you know, maybe pornography you do want to introduce at some point as a concept that's a negative thing that they might come across and might not know what to do if they do come across it. Okay, I'll compromise on that one. But, you know, I think the rest of it has really gone far too far.
Yeah, and you're not alone in thinking this. I mean, the people, whenever we discuss it in the media, and they burst a blood vessel saying it's wholly inappropriate. Yes, of course, people should be aware of the risk. I get the general introduction about you don't want things to be scary, but everything has to be age appropriate. We're joined now by Basil Valentine, who's a TNT titan. Welcome, Basil. What are your views?
I'm flabbergasted, to be honest, Andrew. I really am. I mean, masturbation for children up to the age of 4. I mean, this is surreal stuff, completely unnecessary, wholly inappropriate. Likewise, intercourse teaching for children up to 6. I don't think when I was, still at school, we had any kind of sex education until about the age of 11, when some of the more mature boys were getting into puberty. And I think that's about right. I'm extremely skeptical about the need for any sex education for prepubescent children, other than for the reasons that Claire said, talking about, they might need the required vocabulary to describe abuse. But by the same token, of course, if teachers are going to be entrusted with this degree of intimacy, because that's what it is, with children, then the teaching profession itself may start to become a magnet for would-be child abusers and perverts who may get a thrill simply out of discussing these subjects with children, even if nothing physical very much takes place. But of course, there is the opportunity for that, certainly far more so than if there was a moratorium on sex education for under 11s or something, which is what I would rather see.
Yeah, I mean, you make a very interesting point, and I hear very few people who turn around, if any, who turn around and support this policy about age appropriate. Of course, information is important, but also the other thing that really gets people going is the lack of consultation with parents regarding what information is fed to their children. And I always say that basically it takes a community to bring up a child. That's what they used to say. It's a village to take up a child. It's not just the teachers, but it has to be in collaboration with the school and also the parents and also others involved in that community. What's your take on that, Claire?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so there's a situation we've got in the UK at the moment where a parent asked to see the lesson plan for a sex education lesson after her child had come back, and she was utterly shocked about what she'd been told. And the school refused to release it. And so the parent's been pursuing this through the various sort of legal processes. And she still hasn't been given it on the basis of commercial confidentiality. So it was an outside provider who the school had brought in to do this lesson. And they're hiding behind the idea that someone could steal their wonderful lesson and ruin their company, which is, utter nonsense. And if they were really acting in the best interest of children, they would be wanting to work with the parents of those children and not keeping the parents locked out. I mean, that's a sort of key red flag in terms of safeguarding, is when you're trying to speak to children behind closed doors. That's really problematic in terms of child safeguarding.
Yeah, and again, some excellent points. And I think any parents would be absolutely appalled that they would be kept out of that conversation. What's your take, Basil?
Oh, this is flat out wrong, Andrew. This is absolutely abysmal. The idea that on some spurious grounds of commercial confidentiality, a lesson plan can be withheld from the parents of a young child is abysmal, whether it's any subject, history, geography, or sex education, which is obviously the most sensitive area of all. So, no, I mean, do we have to change laws to bring this about? The other thing is, while I in general agree that the rearing of children is, I wouldn't say community-based, but certainly is influenced by other individuals. I mean, I can only speak for myself in this lifetime, obviously. And in addition to my parents, I had two older sisters. The parents of my friends were also influential because I spent a lot of time at their houses playing games, so therefore, Richard's mother was, my mother when I was in his house. But in terms of a wider community, I lived in a London suburb. There's no village. There was no wider community. In that sense, we went to the church choir. That was all incredibly innocent, as you could imagine. But I am wary of outsourcing parenting to the state and saying community can become a euphemism for the state. And then we end up in the situation that we're now in, where faceless bureaucrats produce obscene documents like the one Claire was referring to and start to claim ownership of a child. That's the key thing. Who does the child belong to? Belongs to the parents up until the age of 18, as far as I'm concerned. And therefore, they should have overall responsibility and control over the rate of sex education, the nature of it, and everything else. And there's a danger, particularly with the furore about transgenderism and all the rest of it, that you can see children even being taken away from their parents because their parents don't go along with the latest guidelines on sex education and have a more traditional or conservative view. So yes, I take your point about community, but at the same time, that can be used as an excuse for a smash and grab on children's rights.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be doing a deeper dive into this and looking at the new threat that there is with the access to online material. Don't touch that dial.
You're listening to the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined today by Basil Valentine and Dr. Clare Craig, and we're looking at the whole sensitive subject of sex education and what information is given to children and to what extent are parents actually kept informed. But before that, I should point out a word from our sponsors. If you're interested in news from the Middle East, check out levantis.me, which breaks down all the main stories into plain English and presents you with just what you need to know each day. For news, comment and analysis and a really fresh, non-partisan take on news from the Middle East and, of course, what's really going on in Gaza, try levantis.me, which you can also find on X as Levantis_ME. Claire, we were speaking beforehand about your background. You no longer work in the NHS, but you have that sort of side and that sort of experience. Fill us in a bit more about how you got involved in this particularly sensitive area.
Okay, so I would say this is not my area of expertise. I'm a diagnostician. I'm a doctor. But over the last 4 years, I've been working in research and educating the public around COVID issues. And in doing that, became co-chair of the HEART group, which is the Health Advisory and Recovery team, who are all professionals and experts who had concerns in their area of expertise around COVID issues. And we've been publishing a weekly bulletin, and we have a website. And it means that I'm surrounded by experts in other fields. And that included a lot of psychotherapists and people involved in education as well. And the whole kind of the whole situation that around this topic is made more difficult because people don't always want to listen to it. And that's the same situation we've had with COVID things. You know, there are certain topics that are slightly painful for people to deal with because they're difficult, and so people stick their fingers in the areas and run away. And so this is one of the topics that we have talked about with HEART, also because of the overreach of the WHO. So, you know, having come from a situation with COVID where the WHO was trying to dictate to the world what they should be doing in a way that turned out to be incredibly harmful, we've just seen more and more expansion of WHO trying to get its tentacles into every walk of life. And so education in schools is one of them. It's not appropriate for them to be doing that the way they are.
Yeah, and again, I think what's always the revelation is exactly what's going on, because a lot of parents, they trust the schools basically to bring up their children in the appropriate way. They're there, and very young minds, and two things is, one, they're not quite sure what they're being taught at school and what access to what information. But secondly, there seems to be very little or no consultation with the parents themselves as to what that content should be. How did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, isn't it? And I think it's a sort of symptom of a lot of things in our society where previously communities would have a lot more say in what was going on in their lives, and there was a much more kind of devolution of power. There was more representation at a lower level. And now we have a lot of things that are dictated top down. And when they are dictated top down, very often happen in a manner that's very hard to oppose, and where there's no one really being held accountable for decisions that are being made. And you see that, across the board. And I'm very familiar with that in medicine, where we see these unauthored protocols being dictated to doctors. And then you find that the doctor who's at the coalface and the patient who they're trying to help doesn't have the sort of choices or the freedom to do necessarily what's best for that patient because of the way it's top down. And so I think that is just a symptom of where we've gone as a society, with more and more power sort of being taken centrally.
Yeah, and it is, again, a worrying thing. It's a common theme here on the Muckrakers about power, and information is power. Doctors, we always rely on experts, and you mentioned about COVID, and doctors disagreed. What happens when you disagree with your colleagues?
Well, I mean, it's really, really tricky, this. So we have, in medicine, in theory, if you can have different doctors disagreeing, and there's debate and there's science, and you work it out and sort of try and learn. And without being able to have debate among disagreeing groups, we never learn, right? We won't progress. We're just going to stay stuck in a rut making mistakes, because that's the only way that we can actually progress and get nearer to a truth. And but the way, in order to sort of defend that, we have medical regulators who've always worked on the basis that if there's a body of professionals who agree with you, then you're allowed to, say you're allowed to treat the patient along the lines that that body of professionals would also treat that patient. But alongside that, there was also this principle that we had freedom of speech. So even if you're the only doctor who believes one particular thing. You're free to express that because you might be right. And even if you aren't right, other people can learn from you by learning why you think that, and therefore refining their own ideas about what is right. And that's how, that's how we have, as a society, always been able to get a little bit closer to the truth. We have, obviously, around COVID, that all changed, and there was massive censorship, and people weren't allowed to object, and people who were in positions of power were producing guidance and protocols and flowcharts and advice in a way that wasn't being held to account. And we do massively depend also on the media to hold people to account. And the media, present company accepted, the media failed massively on that count. They weren't holding anyone to account. They weren't asking the right questions. And now we have, inquiries globally where they're also not asking the right questions. There's really massive systemic problems. And it's kind of frightening that it feels like we got here quite quickly from a position that was really not like this when we were a bit younger.
Yeah, and no, you're so right, and thank you for the praise for the Muckrakers and TNT. We will keep asking the questions. The trouble is this, Claire, and I'm sure you appreciate, is that we became so reliant on experts, and actually any dissenting voices were shut down, weren't they? They were silenced, and more of that's coming out. We had Mark Zuckerberg saying that he regretted the pressure that was put on him to basically stop things like the Hunter Biden laptop story and various things about COVID and what he was allowed to say, what he couldn't say. And it's quite frightening. I do want to do a deeper dive into this, but let me first of all bring Basil. What are your views?
Well, I'm very concerned about this drift towards the normalization or sexualization of children, the language around it. We've seen the insertion into the lexicon of the term minor attracted person for a paedophile, which, okay, perhaps in some legal settings that might be appropriate, but in general, it's a euphemism, isn't it, of the very worst kind. And as Claire points out, who wrote this document? Whose idea was it originally that it's a good thing to teach masturbation to children under the age of 4, or to teach 6-year-olds about sexual intercourse, or 9-year-olds about pornography? Let's see the faces and the names behind it. What's their agenda? Where is this coming from? Who's responsible for this? Because otherwise we're living in some kind of really Kafka / Orwell type society where these, really dreadful edicts, which could be very, very damaging indeed to young minds. I mean, that's the thing. That's the main thing here. It's us, but it doesn't affect me. But the idea of somebody telling my 3-year-old about how to have a what or something, when at that age you're simply not a sexual human being in any meaningful sense of the word. Now, I know that babies are supposed to have random erections and all the rest of it, but they're not associated with sexual imagination or anything like that in the way that masturbation is. So this is really, really damaging precedent. So we want to know who's behind this. Let's have some names out in the open. If they want to have a debate, we'll have a debate. But at the moment, we're just getting this opaque, faceless, sort of increasingly global bureaucracy, as you say, handing down tablets of stone from on high, or in this case, from a very low place indeed.
Do we know who these people are, Claire?
No, we don't. But I think the key to it is that this is a political thing to do. If you are going to dictate to schools what they're educating, that is a political decision. So you've got a situation where political decisions are being made in a vacuum in terms of opposition. There's no who is it that's meant to put the opposing argument to the WHO. There is nobody in that space, and the media aren't doing it. But the media shouldn't be the only ones that should be doing it. We shouldn't have a politicized international body that is not being held to account and that nobody else holds to account. And so it's left to people like you and I to do it, because without raising our voices and objecting, there isn't someone else that's going to do that for us.
Yeah, and you're so right. I go back to the point I was making beforehand, is that a lot of people, and this will be a shock to people, what you had said at the very top of the show, and the information which is being given to such tender minds is horrendous, and it will be a shock for people. So people can't object if they don't know. So as I always say, we want to shine more light and less heat and have that discussion. What I also find shocking is when you get experts who disagree on subjects, that sometimes dissenting voices all too often are silenced. And you must have experienced that in the work that you've done. How have you been able to cope with that?
Yeah, I've absolutely had that. So to be honest, the silencing is frustrating. It's the smearing that's more upsetting. And so, I've been called all sorts of horrible things and had all sorts of allegations thrown at me, all of them false. And you have to work around sort of deciding that if that's all they've got, then that means that you're on the right track, because, obviously I make mistakes as well. And obviously when I make a mistake, that's clear, because then people tell me why I'm wrong. So it becomes very, very clear when you're saying something that is incorrect and when you're saying something that's just an inconvenient truth. And of course, this inconvenient truth is now being labelled as misinformation, and so that's given it a whole different approach for people, because they think that misinformation is something that they need to avoid and it's harmful, it's dangerous. Whereas inconvenient truth is dangerous only to people in power. And that's what this really is inconvenient truth that is always being censored. And so that not being able to have reach is frustrating, but I don't think that we've had no impact. I think that people who have gone out and raise their heads above the parapet and have been speaking and telling the truth and calling out these things that are just unethical have made an impact over the last 4 years or so, and that it's really important we continue to do it. It's slow, but it will get us there eventually.
Yeah, and as you say, it's not just the silencing, but it's the rubbishing and the defamation. And so I know somebody, I've spoken to some on this show and others, where people have lost their livelihood when they're going against what is the traditional or the authorized narrative. Now, that has to be wrong. And as you rightly say, that's why we need programs like the Muckrakers. That's why we need channels like TNT, where we can shine a spotlight on the truth, because that's our only mission, is to get to the truth. And when we're drowning in a sea of disinformation and misinformation, it is getting increasingly difficult. So what advice would you give to people to ensure that we can continue trying to find the truth?
I think people have to, this is the tricky one, right? I think people have to accept that some people are allowed to be wrong. That's the problem we have, is people are very, very uncomfortable with the idea that something they read might not be something that they can just trust in wholeheartedly. So they want to be told, by the BBC, say, that the way the world is and everything the BBC says must be true. And so if they hear something that's contrary to that, they can dismiss it because that's not what the BBC said. Now, the world does not work like that, and humans do not work like that. And the only way we can actually get to the truth is by wading through what is wrong and showing it up for what it is, as wrong. And that takes a bit of work, and it takes a bit of challenge, and it takes a little bit of, it's not necessarily comfortable having to work through those things. But if you pretend that there is some kind of seer that knows everything, you're just going to make a fool of yourself, because that's not the case. It's clearly not the case. You shouldn't put all of your trust into anything, because nobody will be right all of the time. Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. Basil?
Well, yeah, Claire makes a very good point. What's wrong with being wrong from time to time? I mean, science was based on experiments where people made mistakes, trial and error. I found it very useful in life in general, trial and error as a means of getting to the right solution. But more importantly, it's freedom to speak your mind. Hillary Clinton is doing a clip on MSNBC. It's on the rounds on social media at the moment, talking about criminal charges for people who post misinformation or disinformation online. She's the tip of the spear, as it were, of the deep state, the New World Order, call it what you like, her on the Washington side of the pond and Tony Blair on this side of the pond. If you want to know what's in store, then watch their lips moving. They're almost certainly lying, but they're also revealing the agenda that is to come. Now, one person's right is somebody else's wrong. I mean, we had this safe and effective mantra rammed down our throats about the injections, only for it to become very evident in a short space of time that they certainly weren't effective at all. The fallback position ended up being that you're more likely to stay out of hospital, or that if you go to hospital, you're less likely to die. But there was never any evidence of that. That was just a fallback position where it became clear that they didn't stop infection or transmission. And then, of course, they were also supposedly safe. Well, we know very well now, and there are numerous court cases on their way, that they're anything but safe. They're in fact extremely dangerous and can cause severe injuries up to and including death. But we were very, very heavily censored, condemned, harangued, ostracized for saying so for quite a long time. Even now, the corporate media and the likes of Rishi Sunak at a public hall meeting a couple of months ago when he was still PM, they're still clinging to the safe and effective mantra, although as we head into this winter, I think you'll find the appetite for any more of these boosters is virtually nil amongst the general population, because everybody that I know knows somebody that's been vaccine injured to some degree or other, as well as having had COVID. So the problem is, and Norman Fenton in his new book describes it as Goliath, it's a very powerful alliance of big pharma, government, other corporations, media, determined to maintain this facade and indeed to slap down anybody who disagrees with it, regardless of how well credentialed they are, like Clare, like Professor Fenton, like Professor Dalgleish, the Professor of Oncology at St George's Hospital in London, who's been sounding the alarm about the vaccines and these turbo cancers. You couldn't have anybody better credentialed yet. He finds himself among the ranks of the so-called conspiracy theorists. So we've really got to keep driving into the heart of the establishment media to break it apart so that, truth will out, as they say. But the big battles lie ahead, because the European Union under von der Leyen is becoming increasingly fascist in its intention to police the internet. I think we've actually enjoyed a period of relative freedom in the last few years, particularly since Elon Musk took over the X platform. And we might find ourselves marching into some headwinds in the very near future when it comes to freedom of speech. But we'll keep at it, as you know, Andrew.
Oh, absolutely. And as you know, I'm delighted that Elon Musk's father is a regular here on the Muckrakers. He'll be joining us again later this week. But it is so essential that we encourage people to speak out, to question everything. And we come into this sort of stage, if you like, where having been so reliant on experts and let down, if you like, by people, as Claire says, in the media who are not covering the alternative voices. And when those alternative voices turn out to be right, that is an absolutely horrifying thought. We're talking about horrifying thoughts. We're going to be looking at the language and why that's so important. We're also going to have a look at the United Nations Convention Against Cybercrime and the things to look out for there straight after these messages.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, Basil Valentine, and delighted to be joined by Dr. Clare Craig from the Heart Institute. Claire, just before the break, we were talking about the importance of language and age-appropriate language. Fill me in on what you think, because you've had a number of run-ins, if you like, in the media where people are picking you up on the language that is being used. What's the correct language, and what are you being told?
Right, so there was something that I tweeted just this week where I was slapped on the wrist quite rightly, where I was talking about the new UN Convention on Cybercrime, and I used the term child pornography. And I was called up on that to say that, that comes with a connotation that sort of puts it into a category that people sort of see it as an entertainment, right? Whereas if it's talked about correctly, it should be child exploitation and child abuse imagery, because that's what it really, really is. And so I apologize for that. But I think there's a lot of other aspects of language in this area where child sexuality is sort of being normalized. And so one of the examples that you see happening again and again and again is the police and the media failing to use the word rape when they're discussing sex with children. In law, that is rape. Unless it's sort of that grey area of teenagers who are about the same age as each other in a consensual situation, it is rape, and it doesn't get called rape often enough. And in fact, I don't know if you remember back to when the BBC were reporting on the Rotherham rape gangs, and a BBC article described the situation as involving child prostitutes, as if there was such a thing. It's rape when it's a child, and the idea that compliance from a child is in any way equivalent to consent in a sort of adult sexual situation is just not the case. There's also, you'll notice the term sex worker being used in that same sort of way, that it makes it sanitized, and it should not be sanitized. It's not something we should be trying to sanitize. And I think we can also look more broadly at how sex is being normalized for children in terms of the kinds of things that they might come across on the media, on billboards. And I feel like Mary Whitehouse saying it to an extent, but we were in a culture at the moment where in the past you could be edgy with a bit of nudity, or you could be edgy with just kind of any kind of sexual reference point. But now, to be edgy, people are using child abuse as something to get them some kind of media coverage, and they're doing that in the fashion industry, and they're doing that in the music industry, and it's appalling, and we shouldn't be letting that happen. It's not just edgy and cool, and it could never just become edgy and cool. We've got to draw the red line somewhere, right? Because otherwise it's just going to get pushed further and further out.
Yeah. Basil?
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, popular culture finds it fashionable to use younger and younger models, including wholly inappropriate prepubescent children, on occasions, performing roles that really should only ever be performed by adults. I'm very concerned about that. Likewise, Claire says the language that's used needs to be very clear. We talk about the child grooming gangs in the north of England, and as if it stopped at grooming. But of course it didn't. It was rape, multiple counts of rape, for which very long prison sentences should be handed out. I've also seen reports this morning of a situation in Hull where girls were being raped systematically, and it's not taken with enough priority by police force, who pushed it down the agenda when the civil disturbances broke out recently. It always seems to be on the back burner when it comes to police enforcement. So, there's lots of ways where, as Claire says, the red lines have to be established and not breached, not now, not ever, because these are moral absolutes. They're not things that change with society's whims.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to look, I mentioned this before, about the United Nations Convention Against Cybercrime, and the things that everybody's being exposed to at the moment with the internet is access to material which, when we were growing up, you just wouldn't be able to see. It's a huge issue with people with more and more connected devices getting access to this material. Clearly, something has to be done. And what the United Nations Convention says is basically trying to strengthen international cooperation for combating certain crimes committed by means of information and communication technology system, and for sharing the evidence in electronic form of serious crimes. The language, as we said beforehand, though, is very important. And you've got very strong views on this convention, Claire. Tell me what they are.
So the thing that I spoke about around this was the use of the presence of one word and one word that's missing. That's what it really comes down to. So in Article 14 of this draft convention, which is around child abuse and child exploitation. They describe what they mean by that in a way that I think everyone would think is fair. And then they say that it applies to only existing children or an existing child. You think, well, why is that word existing there? Right? What does it mean, first of all? And I've sort of racked my brains about this, and I can think of 3 scenarios in which a child doesn't exist. They've died, they're an adult now, or they're talking about AI images. And any AI images were, by definition, have been built from images of real children. So it's not like they're victimless either. And besides which, you're still fueling that kind of whole ideology, even if it's not got an existing child in it. But you think, well, why has somebody decided to put existing child in there? They're not doing that to protect children. Children don't benefit from that word existing being in there at all. The word existing is only there to protect paedophiles. But there is no way interpretation of why you'd have that word existing in that document except that it protects paedophiles. I just can't see a way around except that it protects paedophiles. So then you're like, well, who's writing this stuff in order to protect paedophiles? Because that's exactly what they're doing. And there's a little phrase shortly afterwards, a clause, I've got the exact wording here. If the conduct is legal and where the material is maintained exclusively for the private and consensual use of the persons involved, then it's excluded. Now, I think what they were trying to get at there is that they don't want to criminalize teenagers who are, sexting each other. And I think that's fair enough. You wouldn't want to criminalize teenagers who are doing that. But they didn't use the word teenager. Why is that not in there? I think that's absolutely critical, if that's what they mean, for that word to be in there. Because otherwise, you're just, again, opening up a massive loophole that can be exploited. Now, having said all of that, I am very uncomfortable anyway with the idea that the UN should be the ones that are trying to create any kind of law in this, in a way which isn't opposed and which isn't democratic and where they aren't held accountable. But, in terms of child exploitation, it is an international problem. And so having some kind of baseline is not something I would be opposed to having. But we've just clearly picked the wrong people to be doing that, because these people they're worse than lost. To be sort of, if you're making excuses for paedophilia by using that word existing, then how are you actually responsible for that to an extent? I think you are. So where does that put you?
Yeah, and I think it's really important, again, that people understand the risk of what artificial intelligence can do. And again, as I say, we speak about this regularly on this program, is that you can create anything through artificial intelligence. Now, they used to say that the camera doesn't lie. Well, that's the biggest lie of all. You can get simple examples. You had the Pope in a puffer was a simple example which took the world by storm. It's now far worse than that. We have Trump snogging Kamala Harris as a video now, but it all looks very, very authentic. The trouble is when it's used for these horrendous images, they are created by artificial intelligence. Everything can be created as a result of it. But as you rightly point out, Claire, these information, the reason it works, these artificial intelligence, it's a machine. It gets fed by existing images to create these imagined images, doesn't it?
It does indeed, yeah. So that's, all that AI is just sort of reinventing what's already exists. It can only do sort of remash up and reinvent what already exists. It has to be taught on something that already exists. And so, yeah, the AI, anything horrific, is based on something horrific.
Yeah. Basil?
No, absolutely. I don't really get involved with AI much. It's been recommended to me as a tool for writing articles, but we've got to go back to basics. It's a terrible expression, really, but we need to reassert the rights of the primacy of the child more than anything else. We need to be able to define what childhood is and allow a child to enjoy its innocence up to a certain age. And it seems the World Health Organization, government, and now possibly school teachers are determined to deprive them of that. And I think that's a tragedy. I really do. The other thing which I believe we're going to come on and talk on at the moment is the abysmal child exploitation rings, child trafficking, which I'm told at the southern border of the United States is now a more lucrative trade even than the drug trade, worth billions of dollars every year, children being sold into slavery, a lot of them from Guatemala and other Central and South American countries, and they end up working in sweatshops and building sites across the United States. Really, it sort of beggars belief that this is going on, but this is one of the most pressing issues that's left off the agenda by the presidential candidates.
Yeah, and again, keep shining the spotlight. The more we can shine a spotlight on the exploitation, and we talk about people trafficking and so on and so forth, and the horrendous things that are going on there. I do, however, just want to get back to the word because it's so important, and I think just so we don't miss the opportunity, as Claire points out, it is a draft convention at the moment, and as a lawyer myself, using the word existing person, as Claire rightly points out, it implies that if somebody's non-existent, they're either dead or possibly artificially created through artificial intelligence,
or they're not born yet. I mean,
yeah, yes. But you have to question why language is so important in these conventions. Is people will look at this and, as you say, look at that for the relevant loopholes. The important language, however, it says where the underlying conduct depicted is legal as determined by domestic law. So that, Claire, may be helpful, because if what's depicted, we're talking about artificial intelligence and the images created there, and those images themselves would not be legal as determined by domestic law, is that some sort of safeguard for us, Claire?
So unfortunately, those are separate clauses. So the existing child thing related to the whole, and the thing around the images being legal was around it being okay for private and consensual use. And the thing about it being legal, though, means that, a child who is being persuaded to do a sexual act on their own and film it, that would be legal under domestic law. But that's not what we want to be legal, do we? If that's being done in an exploitative manner and being that still sort of becomes a very grey area. So yeah, I mean, but you're right, it is a draft, which means these conversations can have an impact, because there is potential to make this better than it is currently by having these conversations.
And that's why I was so keen at the beginning to highlight the extent of the area and why it's so important to highlight the fact that experts such as yourself and your colleagues at Heart are listened to, because it's those experts who can have an influence on the way that these various things are drafted. So anybody watching this program, and there are around the world, millions of people have the potential to watch this, what would you say to them, Claire?
I would say that you need to have these conversations, speak about these things, because I know, people don't want to talk about child abuse online. What a horrible subject to talk about. We all just want to put our fingers in our ears and just relax in the evening or whatever when you've had a hard day at work. But if we keep turning away from these difficult topics, then the people who benefit from us turning away get more and more power, and that's what we've been doing for far too long. And so good people have a responsibility to have these conversations with each other, with their families, with their friends, with their politicians, and with anyone that can has got a bit of a broader reach, because without doing that, that's good, unless sorry, I can't get the expression completely wrong now. Evil will flourish when good people do nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Basil?
Well, Claire makes the point, people with a broader reach, because you can talk to your neighbours and your family till you're blue in the face, but the World Health Organization, or for that matter, the UK government, aren't necessarily going to pay any attention at all. So that's why organizations like the one that Claire is in, Heart, are so important. And I don't know of any other pressure group. Save the Children, I don't know what their attitude is towards this. But really, it's sort of NGOs and MPs and people who may be able to exert some influence over the US/Bill Gates dominated World Health Organization are the ones that we want to target, really. But we live in an era which, as we've said many times on this program, we have a ruling oligarchy almost completely detached from ordinary people and frankly contemptuous of them. So for there to be any meaningful pushback, we've got to be able to make sure we're pushing back where it matters.
No, I wouldn't underestimate the power of a conversation with a friend, actually. I think if we were all having those little conversations, then they filter through to another layer, and then you get to somebody who works at Save the Children. You could have that conversation there. So I really, really wouldn't underestimate the power that each of us has to use our voice to help with this.
No, and it is so essential, Claire, and what I want to emphasize throughout this program is that we need to have those difficult conversations, but the starting point has to be understanding just how big this problem is. And you've fortunately unpacked a lot of that today. If people want to find out more about you and your work, how can they do that?
So I'm on Twitter at Clare Craig Pass, and the Heart website is on Substack at Heart UK or heartgroup.org with our own website.
Very good. I would recommend that everybody do look at that information. This is the last week of TNT. On Friday will be our very last Muckrakers. And we have a galaxy of stars left before we disappear off this particular platform, including Elon Musk, who will be joining me again, and Basil as well on Thursday, as well as a few surprise guests as well. But for now, Basil, as always, thank you very much. Dr. Clare Craig, thank you very much for joining us, for dealing with a very sensitive but very important topic and highlighting the difficulty that you and your colleagues have had in speaking out. Please do continue to speak out, and please, everybody at home, continue to support Claire and her very worthwhile work. But for me, Andrew Eborn, thank you very much for joining me. I will see you again tomorrow.
If you missed this hour, simply go to episodes at tntradio.live